"It is time for you to leave your apprenticeship here," said the great sage to his students, Taksim and Volgildach. "So soon?" cried Volgildach, for it had been a few years since the training began. "Are we such poor pupils? We have learned much from you, master, but you have no more to teach us?" Taksim asked. "You have told us so many tales of great enchanters of the past. Can't we continue to learn until we have reached some level of their power?" "I have one last story for you," smiled the great sage. "Many thousands of years ago, long before the Cyrodiilic dynasty of Roman, and even longer before the Septim dynasty ruled Tamriel, and before there was a mages guild, and when the land called Morrowind was known as Resdain, and the land of Elsewhere was called Aniquena and Pelitine, and the only law of the land was the cruel ways of the Elysian doctrines of Maruk, there lived a hermetic enchanter named Dalak, who had two apprentices, Uthrak and Lorith. Uthrak and Lorith were both equally remarkable students. Both excelled at the arts of the cauldron, mirror casting, the infusions of spirits into mundas, and the weaving of air and fire. Dalak was very fond of his boys, and they of him. On a springtide morn, Dalak received a message from another enchanter named Poethel, who lived deep in the forests of the Colovian heartlands. You must remember that in the first days of the Dark Era, mages were solitary practitioners, and the only organised consortium being the Sigics of Artium. Away from that island, mages seldom saw one another, and even more rarely corresponded. Thus, when Dalek received Poethel's letter, he gave it great attention. Poethel was greatly aged, and he found peace in his isolation was threatened by the Elysian reform. He feared for his life, knowing that fanatical priests and their warriors were close at hand. Dalek brought his students to him. "It will be an arduous and perilous journey to the Colovian states. One that I would fear partaking even in my youth," Dalek said. "My heart trembles to send you two forth to Poethel's cave, but I know he is a great enchanter, and his light must continue to burn in the heart of the continent if we are to survive these dark nights." Uthrak and Lorith pled with their teacher not to send them to Poethel. It was not the priest and the warriors of the Elysian reform they feared, but they knew their master was aged and infirm, and could not protect himself if the reform moved further westward. Finally he relented, and allowed that one would stay with him, and the other would journey forth to the Colovian estates. He would let them decide which one of them would go. The lads debated and discussed, and fought and compromised, and at last they decided to let fate make the choice. They threw lots, and Lorith came up short. He left early the next again morning, miserable and filled with fear. And for a month and a day he tramped through the forest of the midst of the Colovian estates. Through some planning, some skill, and much assistance from sympathetic peasants, he managed to avoid the ever-tightening circle of the Elysian reform by crossing through the unclaimed mountain passes and hidden bogs. When at last he found the dark caverns where Dalak told him to search for Poethel, it was still many hours before he could find the enchanter's lair. No one appeared to be there. Lorith searched through the laboratory of ancient tombs and cauldrons, and herbs kept alive by the glow of mystic circles, strange liquids and gases caught in transparent membranes, and at last he found Poethel, or so he presumed. The desiccated shell on the floor of the study, clutching tools of enchantment, scarcely seemed human. So Lorith decided that he could do nothing further for the mage, and began at once the journey back to his true master Dalek and his friend Uthrak. The armies of the reform had moved quickly since he passed. After more than one close-near encounter, the young enchanter realised he was trapped on all sides. The only retreat that was possible was back in the caves of Poethel. The first thing to be done, Lorith saw, was to find a means to keep an army from finding the laboratory. That, he had found, was exactly what Poethel himself had tried to do. but a simple error even a apprentice enchanter could recognise. He had only succeeded in destroying himself. Lorth was able to take what he had learned from Dalek and apply to Piothel's enchantments, quite successfully. The laboratory was never found or even detected by the Reform. Much time now passed, and in the 480th year of the First Era, the great Aidan Direni won many battles against the Elysian Horde, and many passages and routes that had once been closed were now open. Lorth, now no longer young, was able to return to Dalek. When he last found his way to his master's old hovel, he saw candles of morning, lit in all the trees surrounding. Even before he knocked on the door and met his old fellow student Uthrak, Lorth knew that Dalek had died. "It was only a few months ago," said Uthrak. After embracing his friend, he talked of every day, of every year you were away. Somehow he knew you had not preceded him to the world beyond. He told me that you would come back. The grey-haired men sat before the fire and reminisced of the old days. The sad truth was that they had both discovered how different they had become. Uthrak spoke of carrying on the Master's work, while Lorth described his new discoveries. They left one another that day, each shaking his head, destined to never see each other again. In the years ahead, before they left the mortal world to join their great teacher Dalek, they both achieved their desires. Uthrak went on to become a respected, if minor enchanter in the service of Clan Direni. Lorth took the skill he had learned on his own and used them to fashion the Balak Thurm, the Staff of Chaos. My boys, the lesson is, you have to learn from a teacher to avoid those small but essential errors that claimed the life of such self-taught enchanters such as Piotl. And yet, the only way to become truly great is to try all the possibilities on your own. Ulfric Stormcloak is considered a hero by many for his part in quelling the Forsworn uprising. It is said that when the Empire abandoned Skyrim, and the natives of the Reach rebelled, undoubtedly due to the Nords' poor treatment of them, Ulfric Stormcloak and his militia was there to retake their land from the Forsworn. In all the bravado and epic yarns the Skalds compose of his exploits, you would think Ulfric to be a giant of a man, equal to that of Tiber Septim in his cunning, leadership, and decisive actions. But the truth is far more revealing. Yes, from the 4th Era 174 to 176, the Forsworn did in fact rule over the Reach as an independent kingdom from Skyrim. Yes, this was accomplished whilst the Empire was beset by Altmari Dominion forces and could not send a legion to re-establish order. And yes, Ulfric Stormcloak did quell the rebellion without Imperial assistance. That much is true. But what the bards often fail to tell in their stories is that the Forsworn kingdom was quite peaceful for those 2 years, when they were in power. True, some crimes were committed against the former Nord landowners, often those being accused of being the harshest towards their native workers. But on the whole, the Forsworn ruled their lands fairly, and were making overtures to be recognised by the Empire as a legitimate kingdom. On the wake of the aftermath of the Great War, you can imagine the backlog on stately matters the Empire had. Before a peace treaty could be resolved with the Forsworn, a militia led by Ulfric Stormcloak sieged the gates of their capital, Markarth. What happened during that battle was war, but what happened after the battle was over is nothing short of war crimes. Every official who worked for the Forsworn was put to the sword, even after they had surrendered. Native women were tortured to give up the names of the Forsworn fighters who had fled the city or were in the hills of the Reach. Anyone who lived in the city, Forsworn and Nord alike, were executed if they had not fought with Ulfric and his men when they breached his gates. "You are with us, or you are against us," was the message on Ulfric's lips as he ordered the deaths of shopkeepers, farmers and elderly, and any child old enough to lift a sword that had failed in the call to fight with him. So when a grateful empire accepted Ulfric's victory and sent soldiers to re-establish the rule of law in the Reach, it was no surprise that he would demand to be allowed to worship Talos freely before the Legion could even enter. With chaos running through the streets of Markarth, and the reports of deaths rising every day, the Empire had no choice but to grant Ulfric and his men their worship. We allowed them to worship Talos in full violation of the White Gold Concordat, with the Altmeri Dominion, which recognises the elven belief that Talos as a human cannot be one of the Divines, and jeopardising the treaty that so many were sacrificed for during the Great War. The Empire was wrong. But what choice did they have, I ask you, against the Bear of Markarth, Ulfric Stormcloak? No is not an answer. Since the legendary victory of Tiber Septim over the barbarian natives in the Battle of Old Hroldan, Imperial and Nord scholarship has cast the people of the Reach as little more than savages, prone to irrational fits of violence, worshipping old heretical gods and fetishising beasts and nature spirits that any civilised person would best well avoid. In truth, these accounts are little more than victors' essays, a perspective narrowed by the Empire's constant strife with the ancient, proud people that lived in this land far before Tiber Septim walked the soil of Tamriel. In light of this, I hope to create a more complete, accurate and fair assessment of a group that has long suffered under the role of enemy, troublemakers, and them. Let us begin with the Forsworn, the so-called Madmen of the Reach. The Imperial Legion classifies them as little more than brigands, noting their constant raids and ambushes within the hold. But none of their military reports ask the question of why. If they were merely a group of bandits, surely they would be focused on acquiring gold and minimising deaths among their own. But the opposite is true in the Forsworn attacks. Large sums of coin are often left behind, and their fighters easily throw away their lives rather than risk capture by Imperial soldiers. It is this incongruity that led me to Markarth, the capital city of the Reach, in search of answers. There I met one of the native peoples, an old woman who preferred not to be named in my writings. She told me of her family's long history, how she believes they originally came from High Rock, home of the Bretons, which would explain the similar faces and stature to the two peoples. How the Nords came and took their lands, their gods, and their culture from them. When asked about the Forsworn, the old woman would say that they are the real men and women of the Reach, those who refuse to give in to the Nords, and those that still practice the ancient traditions that the rest of their people had abandoned in exchange for peace. In time, I was able to create trust with many more natives in my search that corroborated the old woman's story. By chance, one of them arranged a meeting between myself and what I thought was an elder member of his village. I was shocked to find that I was led to a camp filled with the animal skulls, severed heads, and still beating hearts that I could read about from the military reports back from the Imperial City. There I met Cortoran, a Forsworn, who seemed amused at the prospect of me writing down his story, which I quote in full below. You want to know who the Forsworn are? We are the people who must pillage our own land, burn our own ground. We are the scourge of the Nords, the axe that falls in the dark, the scream before the gods claim your soul. We are the true sons and daughters of the Reach. The spirits and hags have lived here from the beginning, and they are on our side. Go back and tell your empire that we will have our own kingdom again, and on that day, we will be the ones burying your dead in a land that is no longer yours. There's a reason I was kicked out of Daggerfall, chased out of Elderroot, and banned from Mournhold. I've tried every variety of intoxicant wine, ale, and Argonian swill this world has to offer. I've sampled skooma with the Khajiit, licked on Argonian history, and hunted magical toads with the Bosmer. None of that compares to Nord Mead. There's nothing like it. The purest stuff is made in Nord villages, But we are at war with the Nords, and a Breton has no guarantee of surviving a trip like that. Leave that sort of thing to professionals. There is still hope, however. If you're ever at a tavern, and there's a cask of Nord mead, you'd be fooled to pass it up. Mead is made by fermenting honey in water, though a few recipes call for molasses. Sometimes, you add grain mash and strain it, but that isn't necessary. Some of the high elves call it honeyed wine, but mead needs more than good honey, and every meadery has its own recipe. After you drink enough mead, you learn the names of the brewmasters who created them. A drunk Nord will gladly punch another in the face over the honour of a good brewmaster. Then again, a drunk Nord would punch anyone in the face for just about anything. Every brewmaster has a distinct blend of spices, fruit, and sometimes hops, which makes the mead bitter, which makes some Nords bitter too. I've even heard tales of mead mixed with the blood of heroes, allegedly granting them the words of a poet or Skald. I'd like a mead named after me, but I'm not going to bleed for it. An Altmer once told me that brewing is the basis of all cultures. It's why our ancestors started farming and forming cities. It's what we do when we've got too much wheat and barley and hops, and we're sick of farming. The culture of drinking seems to be what keeps Nords together. In that case, Nords must be sick of farming, because they brew and drink prodigious amounts of mead. Whenever a cask of really good mead is opened, Nords gather round because they know that the cask won't last long. But if you don't know how to behave in a Nord drinking culture, you'll end up broken, hungover, and helpless. I found out the hard way. Nords love to drink, but more than that, Nords respect those who can endure adversity. I know it sounds flowery for explaining why two drunk Nords would have a hit me hard in the face contest, but really, that's why their culture celebrates getting drunk. A Nord can gain respect by consuming more mead than anyone else, just as he's respected for surviving a blizzard or killing a bear with a sharp stick. Nord honour is something they talk about endlessly when they're drunk, and even more when they're sober. So the first thing you'll learn about Nords is if you want the respect, never turn down a drink. It's a test, and if you can't handle the next drink, leave. Otherwise you'll wake up somewhere hilarious, but you won't be laughing. Nords also love Skalds. Songs and stories go over well with a drunk audience, once they've had enough of brawling, boasting, and throwing axes at each other. Their songs are all about how they're better than anyone else, at everything. They've all heard these over and over again, so bring some of your own. They're desperate to hear something new. Anywhere you go, drinking is also a good way to redress a mistake, or make an apology, and it's the same with Nords. If you lose a contest, you need to buy a drink. If you make a mistake or offend someone, you need to buy a drink. If you're insulted, stand there and take it. Then you need to buy a drink. You don't have to be the best brawler around to survive a room full of drunken Nords. You can also impress them by being clever, or by being talented. But you better be really good. For when it's time to take a punch in the face, you better be ready for a punch in the face. If you don't like getting punched, there are some things you should never talk about, like politics, who's the best brewmaster, and who punches the hardest. And never demand to know why someone just punched you in the face. If you want to hear more, buy me a drink the next time. I'm in Daggerfall, and I'll tell you a story. Welcome, loyal officer of the Empire. You have been given this guide to help you and your men under your command to better understand the geography of Skyrim. Skyrim is organised into 9 holds. A hold is a large area of land, roughly the equivalent to a county back in Cyrodiil. Each hold is governed by a Jarl who maintains his court in the hold's capital city. 4 of these holds are fairly small and sparsely populated. As a result, the capitals are little more than towns. The 5 major holds of Skyrim act as the capitals for the larger holds. Following is a detailed review of each hold. Located at the eastern reaches of Skyrim, Eastmarch shares a common border with Morrowind. Jarl Ulfric Stormcloak rules from the ancient city of Windhelm, and he and his followers should be considered your most serious threat. Do not tread lightly in Eastmarch, for the Stormcloaks are at their strongest and their most organised in these lands. As an Imperial soldier, you will find few friends here. Solitude. The seat of High King of Skyrim, and the capital of Hafengar hold, and it's always welcomed the Empire with open arms. Much commerce flows along the rivers here, and you will find the folk of this hold to be among the most hospitable in Skyrim. As you venture forth in your campaign, be sure to maintain a secure supply line back to Solitude. The Empire maintains ample provisions in the castle dower, from which General Tullius commands all the legions stationed in Skyrim. Hjalmarch is divided evenly between windswept tundra dotted with farms and a huge stinking salt marsh. There is little of interest here, save perhaps for the hold's capital, Morthal. The Jarl, Egrod Ravencrone, has been cooperative enough with the Empire in the past, but will ultimately look out for her own interest if put in a difficult position. While the hold offers minimum strategic value to the Empire, it would make an ideal staging ground for a Stormcloak siege of Solitude, and so must be held against the enemy. The Pale is a barren realm covered by vast fields of ice and snow. Its boundaries stretch from the centre of Skyrim all the way to the northern coast. Here, at the capital city of Dawnstar, can be found one of the busiest ports in the province. With access to the coastal waterways of Skyrim, Dawnstar could prove vital in the war effort. Should the Stormcloaks choose to attack Solitude from the river, this port would make a tempting target due to its close proximity. Dominating the western border of Skyrim, the Reach is made up almost entirely of steep, craggy mountains. Little grows in this forbidden realm, but the capital city of Markarth is a nigh impregnable stone fortress that would make an excellent defensive position for either side of the war. Be aware of this dangerous region of Skyrim, as it's home to the Forsworn, the rebellious natives of the Reach. They know the terrain, can strike without warning, and count the Empire as enemy. If they attack you, you must neither give nor expect any mercy. The Rift occupies the southeast corner of Skyrim, and much like the Reach, in the west, it's dominated by tall mountain peaks. The climate in the Reach is milder than in the northern holds, and there is more vegetation to be found here. Farming thrives as a result. A word of warning about Riften though, the hold capital city. Our agents have reason to suspect that the Thieves Guild makes it home here, though it is now much diminished from its strength in previous years. Nevertheless, mind that your men keep an eye on their coin purses should they have reason to spend any length of time in the city. The central hold, Whiterun, is characterised by wide grassy plains that are home to numerous farms. Many roads pass through Whiterun, joining more distant holds together. the Hold's capital city, also called Whiterun, sits high on a rocky promontory, amid a large flat swath of scrubland. Among the wealthiest cities of Skyrim, Whiterun has usually proven friendly to the Emperor's soldiers. Winterhold is a bleak and snow-blown hold in the northeast corner of Skyrim, and it's utterly inhospitable. Perhaps the mages at the College of Winterhold chose to make their home there, because they knew they would be left largely alone. As with Whiterun, the name Winterhold describes both the hold and the capital city, though the word city hardly applies. The hold capital is a meagre village, but built near the Mages' College. Few other noteworthy settlements exist in this frozen waste, and it's unlikely to play any significant part in the war. Now strangely, my favourite hold, Falkreath, seems to be missing from this book, and I thought that might be a mistake by the developers, and I had a look online, and there seems to be no real answer. It could be that despite Falkreath Hold being a part of Skyrim, it was once a part of Cyrodiil. Falkreath Hold is covered in pine forests, and is described by its citizens as being covered in a fine mist which makes it seem seasonless. The mountains rising above Falkreath are well above the snowline, striking a stark comparison to the rest of the hold. The most distinguishing geographic feature is Lake Illinalta, which covers a large portion of the central region and acts as a source for the White River. In the town of Falkreath there lays a huge graveyard, which represents years of warfare between the borders. And due to this clear presence of death throughout history, the Forest Hold has naturally gathered a reputation for being haunted. Born in the Second Era of the year 546 to Queen Mabjarn Flamehair, Prince Jorunn grew up knowing that his elder sister, Nirnhild, was fated to take the throne. A singer of rare talent in a culture that reveres the power of the human voice, Jorunn studied at Skald's retreat on the Isle of Gold outside Riften. It was there he learned all that could be taught by the most renowned bards of the Eastern Kingdom. He was dubbed the Skald Prince of Skyrim. Now Jorunn spent most of his youth in artistic and philosophical pursuits, cultivating a broad array of artists, artisans and performers throughout eastern Skyrim and beyond. He spent time in Mournhold, Stormhold, Such, Ellenhere, and is even reputed to have visited Solitude, the capital of western Skyrim, in disguise. Though he claimed to have no interest in politics, or the business of rule, his natural leadership qualities made him an unofficial leader of the creative community wherever he found himself. Though he received little formal schooling in the arts of arms and warfare, as little as a prince of the Nords could manage, anyway, travelling across Tamriel was always a dangerous activity. His travels taught him less orthodox ways of dealing with trouble. Jorunn was in Riften when the Akaviri of Dir Kemal assaulted the northeast coast of Skyrim in the Second Era 572. Jorunn and his closest comrades, the Pack of the Bards, fought their way up the coast to Windhelm, arriving just in time to see its gates breached by the Akaviri. Jorunn hurled himself into the fray, street fighting being something he had experience with, but he was unable to prevent the fall of the city and the slaying of Queen Mabjarn and Nirnhild, the brief queen, who both went down fighting. Wounded and devastated, Jorunn barely escaped the sack of Windhelm alive. Feeling for the first time the responsibility of his royal birth, he decided to appeal to the Greybeards for aid, and so made his way stealthily, but quickly, to High Hrothgar. For reasons that have not been divulged, the Greybeards decided to teach the Skald Prince a Thum, one that summons a hero from Sovngarde to fight for the tongue who uses it. But in Jorunn's voice, the thum became a royal call of valour, and the summoned hero was none other than Wulfharth, the Ash King. Together with Wulfharth and Jorunn, now claiming the title of the Skald King, they rallied the Nords of eastern Skyrim, mustering an army from the Rift and the outer regions of Eastmarch, then fortifying Riften. Dir Kamal and the Akaviri moved south from Windhelm and found Riften, which was defended by angry Nords inspired by the presence of Wulfharth and eager to fight. So Dir Kamal bypassed Riften and marched on Mournhold instead, as the Akaviri leader assumed that the Nords would be glad to see him go. However, that choice was a fatal mistake, as Jorunn and Wulfharth led their army in pursuit of the Akaviri force, and the Nord army entered Morrowind for the first time since the Battle of Red Mountain. The Akaviri army was caught at Stonefalls between the Nords and a Dunmer legion led by Amalexia, but the outcome of the Great Battle hung in the balance until a surprise intervention from a phalanx of Argonian shellbacks led by a trio of reptilian battle mages. The Akaviri line was broken, and they were divided into the sea, where they drowned by the thousands. Following this great victory in Tamriel, the Ash King, his purpose fulfilled, returned to Sovngarde, and in Windhelm, 3 weeks later, Jorunn was crowned High King in the throne room of the Palace of Kings. The last time I saw the old Argonian, I was taken by how alive he seemed, even though he was at the throes of death. The secret, he said, of staying alive is not in running away, but by swimming directly at danger. Is that how you managed to find the claw? I asked, brandishing the small carving as if it were a weapon. I had found it among his possessions, which I was helping him to divvy amongst his benefactories. Do you know what this is? He asked. I've heard stories, I answered. The same as you. Looks like one of those claws for opening and sealing doors in the ancient crypts. I've never seen one for myself before, though. And so you want me to have it? I joked. Where did you get this? It's truly amazing what you can find along the bottom of a lake, he answered. Did you ever try to use it? I whispered to him. He was staring at the ceiling now, and by the way his fogged eyes darted around the room, I could tell he was seeing his memories instead of the cracked stone above us. Dotting the landscape of Skyrim, the ancient Nordic ruins are a testament to the ingenuity of the Nordic people of the past. When constructing the final resting place of the noble class, these supposedly barbaric people proved quite the opposite, by developing some of the most sophisticated and clever defences ever encountered. Coupled with the presence of fearsome Draugr, these tombs have become quite a challenge for the would-be treasure hunters. Suddenly the Argonian snapped at me. Where do you think I got this? He barked, tearing his tunic open and showing a white scar on his scales. The blasted Draugr. They got the drop on me. Just too many of them. For the Draugr tend to lay dormant until someone happens upon their resting place. These undead beings tend to animate rather rapidly and silently. Perhaps some of the most amazing engineering marvels of all to be found in the ruins are the switches and pressure plates and the traps designed to kill. Suddenly I felt awful, since I knew how much he hated talking about the battles he had been in. To him it was enough he had survived, and simply, any stories would just amount to boasting. For a while we sat in silence. You know what always bothered me? He asked. why they even bothered with the symbols. The what? The symbols, you fool, look at the claw. I turned it over in my hand, and sure enough, etched into the face were 3 animals. A bear, an owl, and some kind of insect. What do the symbols mean? He explained to me about the claw, and the animals that were etched onto it, and the sliding doors that it opened. I paused for a minute. Wait a minute, isn't that a little bit easy? Why even have the combination if you're going to write it on the key? For yes, it is true, the perils of the Nordic ruins are not without reward. The burial chambers in some of the larger complexes have been known to contain all manners of riches, from gold coins to even the occasional enchanted weapon or armour. The Argonian then replied, as I lay there bleeding on the floor, I figured it out. The doors. They were never meant to keep people out. They were meant to keep the Draugr in. The tragedies befallen Morrowind do bring forth pity from even the stoutest Nordic heart. The Dark Elves deserve our condolences, but thus far they do not show themselves deserving of the simplest acts of charity. There are very different approaches on how to deal with the imminent problem of Morrowind, and I offer 2 options as seen in practice in Skyrim. One should serve as an exemplar, the other a cautionary tale. Consider Riften, which shares a border with the ruined province. A number of the Dark Elves have made their homes there, but they are expected to earn their livelihood, as is any other citizen of the great city. They ply trades as merchants, work in the temple, and serve in the keep. Honest labour to be admired from a race that was so recently in such dire straits as to even warrant this discussion. Today the city still has its share of problems, but they are not traceable to any influx of outsiders in their presence. In short, the Dark Elves have properly assimilated themselves into the Skyrim way of life, to be expected from any newcomer to these lands. For an alternative approach, we only have to look at the once proud city of Windhelm to see what can happen when our arms are cast too wide open in welcome. To think that the city of Ysgramor, whose very name was made in driving out the elves from our sacred home, would open itself as a welcome destination for any refugees from the smoking sulphur, is a disgrace to the very idea of being a Nord. And what has become of this? Predictably, the lazy, discontented rabble has descended into squalor in an area now delicately referred to as the Grey Quarter of this city. They were not expected to contribute, and so have not. That they attempt to make over a proud Nord city into a little pocket of Morrowind is insulting enough, but the amount of unrest they have provoked even within the proper city walls should give any other Jarl a reason to fear. The Nords I talk to in the city speak of constant strife and crime coming from the Grey Quarter, with no respite in sight. The city guard barely patrol there, leaving the Dark Elves to mete out whatever passes for justice in their native customs. The respectable families of the city, the Cruel Seas and the Shatter Shields, speak with an almost parental affection of the Argonians in their employ, but the Dark Elves have made no effort to assimilate themselves to the proper city dwellers. There is cause for optimism though, as Jarl Ulfric is not nearly so tolerant of these substandard beings as his fathers were. Indeed, the soft hand of Hogg can be seen in the city's Argonian population as well. The fishmen at least have learned how to best contribute to their new home. They have proven themselves as models, toiling at the docks with utmost efficiency and bright smiles. It would do the Dark Elves well to pay heed to their scaly cousins. I would expect in due course that they will find themselves either contributing more directly or once again wandering the land in search of a roof and warmth. The late Third Era was a period of remarkable religious ferment and creativity. The upheavals of the reign of Uriel VII were the only outward signs of the historical forces that would eventually lead to the fall of the Septim dynasty. This so-called dragon break was first proposed at this time by a wide variety of cults and fringe sects across the empire, connected only by their common obsession with the events surrounding Tiber Septim's rise to power, the founding myth, if you will, of the Septim dynasty. The basis of this dragon break doctrine is now known to be a rather prosaic error in the timeline printed in the otherwise authoritative Encyclopaedia Tambrielica, first published in the Third Era during the early years of Tiber Septim's reign. At this time, the archives of the Alinor were still inaccessible to human scholars, and the extant records from the Elysian period were extremely fragmentary. The Elysians had systematically burned all the libraries they could find, and their own records were largely destroyed during the War of the Righteousness. The author of the Encyclopaedia Tambrielica was apparently unfamiliar with the Elysian year, which their priesthood used to record all dates. We now know this refers to the length of the long vision trances undertaken by the High Priestess, which might last anywhere from a few weeks to several months. Based on analysis of the surviving trance scrolls, as well as the murals from the Elysian temples, I estimate that the Elysian Order actually lasted about 150 years rather than the famous 1008 years given by the Encyclopaedia Tambrielica. The mystery of the millennial plus rule of the Elysians was accepted but unexplained until the spread of the Lorcan cults in the late Third Era, when the doctrine of the Dragon Break took hold. Because this dating and explanation was so widely held at this time, and then repeated by historians down through to today, it has come to have the force of tradition. Recall, however, that the Third Era historians were already separated from the Elysians by a gulf of more than 2,000 years, and history was still in its infancy, relying on few archives of those early days. Today, archaeology and paleonumerology have confirmed what my own research in Elysian dating first suggested, that the Dragon Break was invented in the late Third Era, based on scholarly error, fueled by obsession with eschatology and Numidianism, and perpetuated by scholarly inertia. Sovngarde, a Re-Examination by Beredit Jastal. Speculation regarding Sovngarde, the Nordic Hall of Valor. Death. It is something we all face. Or do we really? Just ask the nearest Nord what he thinks of the end of life, and you will likely be treated to a horrific story of blood, bone, and viscera, or of courageous deed and heartbreaking sorrow. Carnage notwithstanding, there may be more to death than the average Nord warrior realises. For new evidence suggests a life beyond the battlefield, where a valiant Nord may live forever, downing Mead and engaging in contest of strength and skill. But in order to fully understand the possibility of a Nord's eternal life after death, one must re-examine the legend surrounding the most wondrous of warrior retreats, Sovngarde. According to the ancient writings and the oral traditions of the Nords, going back as far as the late Merithic era, there exists a place so magnificent, so honoured, that the entrance lies hidden from view. Sovngarde it is called, built by the god Shor to honour those Nords who have proven their merit in battle. For within this Hall of Valour, time as we know it has no meaning. The concept of life and death are left at the doorstep, and those within exist in sort of a self-contained euphoria, free of pain, suffering, and the worst malady a North could ever suffer, boredom. But just how well hidden is the entrance to Sovngarde? Well, it is a matter of debate, and there are those who believe that Shore's Great Hall is just a myth, for there are no actual accounts from the Nords who have experienced the wonders of Sovngarde, and then returned to tell the tale. Not that that has stopped anyone from looking. Some Nords spend a lifetime searching for the mysterious hidden entrance to Sovngarde. Most return home sad and broken, their hearts heavy with failure. They'll never know of the pleasure of a mead flagon which never empties, or a wrestling tournament without an end. What some may ask, does the entrance of Sovngarde have to do with death? Well, everything. That is according to a series of ancient parchments recently discovered in the attic of a deceased Nord's home in Cyrodiil. What at first seemed to be a series of love letters was later found to be communication between Filga Fourfingers, a medium of some note, and the ghost of a Nord warrior named Rolf the Large. According to the parchments, Rolf had spent his entire life searching for the entrance to Sovngarde, without success. He was returning to his home in a village in Skyrim when he was waylaid by a band of giants. Rolf fought bravely, but he was quickly killed, and the giants proceeded to play catch with his head. Amazingly so, all of this was seen by Rolf in ghostly form as he drifted away from the scene, soaring upwards into the heavens where he finally arrived, the magnificent hall of Sovngarde. Rolf could not believe his good fortune, and his foolishness, for not having realised the truth for so many years before. For death is the only entrance to Sovngarde. And so he was told by Shore himself, who greeted Rolf the Large as a brother, and personally handed him a leg of roast mutton and the hand of a commonly wench. Sovngarde, Shore told him, can be entered by any Nord who dies valiantly, in honourable combat. And so it is time for the Nords to learn the truth. Eternal life can be theirs, without the need to spend their entire mortal life in vain pursuit of something completely unattainable. Dismember, decapitation or evisceration seems a small price to pay for the chance to spend an eternity with Shore in the wondrous halls of Sovngarde. And so that ends today's tale in Tamriel. If you're intrigued by that story, or you have any feedback at all, please feel free to leave it in the comments section below. Until next time, see ya. To the esteemed Jarl Valdemar of Winterhold. First, please allow me to offer my sincere condolences. I understand that you, like many others, have lost family, and you have my deepest sympathies. I also understand that some on your council have placed the blame for this horrible disaster on my colleagues at the college. While I can certainly appreciate the shock at the scope of recent events and the desire to comprehend what has happened, I must strongly urge you to reconsider the full situation. It is well known the importance of this institution, but it is also well known that the relations between the people of Winterhold and the college itself have been, shall we say, strained over the last few decades. After the Oblivion Crisis, it was only natural that the people of Skyrim showed a distrust for mages, even though the vast majority of us actively worked to counter the actions of the Mythid Dawn cult. The college expected such a reaction, and hoped that the distrust would fade over time. And then the Red Year. No one foresaw the explosion of Red Mountain, or the devastating effect it would have on Dunmer culture. Your predecessor was kind enough to welcome many of the refugees, particularly those who could contribute to the college studies. We were quite grateful. When Solstheim was generously offered to the Dunmer as a new home, I was as surprised as any. I did not, however, share the apparent expectation that all Dark Elves would leave Skyrim. It did not go unnoticed that many in Winterhold were unhappy at how many mages chose to stay at the college rather than relocate. And now, the storms that have racked the coast of Skyrim for close to a year have finally broken, but at a great cost to us all. This great collapse has devastated Winterhold. It was unexpected, I assure you. That the college has remained unaffected is only a testament to the protective magics placed around it for so long. It in no way implies that we were somehow prepared specifically for this event, and is certainly no indication that the college was somehow responsible. I certainly would never hold you accountable for the gossip spread amongst the people of Winterhold. I would urge you, though, to not allow that gossip to take root and become the commonly held belief, as I do not wish to see a relationship crumble like Winterhold has. As I assure you, the college will remain here for a very, very long time. Your persistent advocate, Archmage Deneth. Ravenrock is one of the more interesting colonies of Morrowind of the last 2 centuries. So much has happened to this tiny town in such a short amount of time, and so many lives have been affected by it. I feel it necessary to describe its rich history within these volumes. During my research, I lived in Ravenrock for almost 3 years, and I got to know many of my fellow Dunmer who call Ravenrock their home. I hope that my readers will appreciate the amount of fortitude and perseverance that it must take to endure life in such an inhospitable and untamed land. Ravenrock was founded in the 427th year of the Third Era by the East Empire Company in response to the discovery of a rich ebony mine on the southern edge of the island of Soltang. The construction of the town took several months, and the mine immediately started yielding ebony ore that the miners shipped to Windhelm in Skyrim. By the year 432 of the Third Era, the town was home to over 30 people, all of whom depended on the mine for their livelihood. At this time, Ravenrock was almost exclusively inhabited by Imperials and a few Nords who were drawn to the mine's wealth. When the Oblivion Crisis arose in the Third Era of the year 433, Ravenrock remained largely untouched by Mehrunes Dagon's forces, and work continued as usual. The bulk of the Imperial Guard that was stationed in Ravenrock was recalled to Cyrodiil to fight the invading forces, but a few soldiers remained behind in order to protect the ebony mine from bandits. It's uncertain whether any Oblivion Gates ever opened on Solstheim, as there appears to be no such records of anything occurring there. In the first years of the Fourth Era, after the disruption of Aldruin, many of the Dunmer great houses sent out small groups on their own to seek places to re-establish themselves. House Redorand's group was led by Brea Morvain, who immediately struck out for Solstheim. After some quick negotiations with the East Empire Company, and some speculate quite a bit of coin changing hands, Brea's group was allowed to settle in Ravenrock, where they quickly became part of the mining colony's way of life. The Dunmer proved to be both hard-working and reliable when it came to working in the mines, impressing the East Empire Company and solidifying their relationship, and all was going quite well, until that fateful day in the 5th year of the Fourth Era, when the Red Mountain erupted, sending massive blasts across the Sea of Ghosts and struck Solstheim in all its fury. Ravenrock was heavily damaged by this wave of force, which toppled several of its stone structures and obliterated many of the wooden ones. Ironically, the mine once again proved to be the town's saving grace, as most of the population of Ravenrock was working underground at the time, and was completely shielded by the blast. This event wasn't without cost though, as Ravenrock was heavily dependent on the nearby Fort Frostmoth for its defence, but the eruption had almost completely wiped it from the face of Solstheim. The few soldiers that survived took residence in Ravenrock itself and attempted to set up a makeshift garrison there, but these scant few were hardly a match for the potential threats to their town. With the East Empire Company's permission, Brea brought in some of the House Redorand's elite Redoran Guard to fill the void. The Guard proved to be an ideal replacement for the fallen Imperial soldiers, and have been guarding the town ever since. After many years of relentless ash storms from the ever-erupting Red Mountain back in Morrowind, Solstheim's southern reaches had transformed into pure ash wastes, reminiscent of those present on Vardenfell itself. The storms would leave behind deep dunes of ash that made life exceedingly difficult in Ravenrock. In order to protect the town from these drifts, Bear of Markarth proposed that the East Empire Company construct a large wall of her own design to protect the east end of town. The company quickly agreed and provided the necessary funds. After almost a year, the construction was complete, and the huge edifice was named the Bulwark. The wall proved to be extremely effective and allowed work to continue unabated in the mines. In the 16th year of the Fourth Era, when Solstheim was passed into the hands of the Dunmer people, the East Empire Company was forced to relinquish Ravenrock's control to House Redoran. The council quickly named Bear of Markarth as a councillor of their new town, and allowed her to rule Solstheim as she saw fit. As a result of this changing of the guard, almost the entire imperial population left Ravenrock and returned to Cyrodiil. Bear continued to welcome the Dunmer that elected to settle on Solstheim. Some chose to stay in Ravenrock to work in the mines, others took to more familiar territory and began a nomadic lifestyle in the Ash Wastes. The next few decades were the golden years for Ravenrock. Bear of Markarth was keeping the peace, the mines were producing large quantities of ebony, and the Dunmer that lived on the island were happy. Almost 50 years of prosperity. In the 65th year of the Fourth Era, Bear of Markarth finally succumbed to old age and passed away. She was interred in the family's ancestral tomb, and her son, Leril Markarth, took her place. The people who had lived in Ravenrock during Bear's time as councillor were pleased to discover that Leril shared his mother's notion of rulership. He was fair and compassionate, which kept the people on the island quite happy for many more decades. So all was going well in Ravenrock until the 95th year of the Fourth Era, when an attempt on Leril's life was made without warning. Fortunately though, the attack was unsuccessful thanks to the prowess of the Redoran Guard. Under questioning by Captain Modin Velith, the assassin was revealed to be Valur Ulan of House Hlaalu. House Hlaalu had been at odds with House Redoran for many years following their removal from the Council of the Great Houses. The Hlaalu believed that House Redoran was instrumental in this reorganisation, and have held a grudge ever since. Their attempt on Leril's life was meant to send a message to the Council that House Redoran were not as mighty as they might have seemed, and they were truly vulnerable and weak. The Redoran Guard investigated further and discovered that Valur had been organising a coup in Ravenrock in an attempt to fully wrest control of the island from Leril's grasp. Valur and his conspirators were executed and the coup was quelled. Several recent events have served to solidify the Dunmer people's respect for Bear of Markarth. In the 130th year of the Fourth Era, the bulwark began to show its age and threatened to crumble. The councillor elected to use the bulk of his personal fortune to have it repaired. In the 150th year of the Fourth Era, a small force of Argonians landed on Solstheim with the attempt of wreaking havoc on the island, and Councillor Markarth led the charge against them personally. And in the 170th year of the Fourth Era, when the ebony mine finally began to dry up, he drained the remainder of his coffers to keep the people fed. By the year 181 of the Fourth Era, the mine's ebony veins were completely exhausted. Leril ordered the mine to be shut down, and Ravenrock turned to hunting and fishing for its trade. A few Dunmer families departed for Solstheim and returned to the mainland, but most stayed behind. At present, Leril Markarth is still the ruler of Ravenrock. The Redoran Guard continues to maintain order within the town and the surrounding area, keeping Ravenrock's residents safe and in line. If even so much as a rumour of dissent reaches Leril's ears, he has it quashed immediately. He's well aware that there may be a few Hlaalu loyalists still present among her population that would like to see him dead. The future may appear bleak for Ravenrock, but the spirit of its inhabitants will never be broken.